if you look at mental health 20 years ago, they would have sort of seen mental health as being about like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and maybe like major depression. Now we see mental health as about everyone. I think we need to do that with neurodiversity and see autism as part of that. I think then we can have a much more inclusive conversation about this in the workplace, because the reality is that there are some people who are autistic, but across the whole workforce, every single employee will have things that will enable them to succeed and thrive, and things that will act as a barrier towards that. And I think if we can get better at reflecting that diversity that exists within our workforce, then it doesn't really just benefit autistic people, it benefits everyone and it benefits the organisation.
Greetings all and welcome to episode 3 of Working to Work. This episode is coming to you from Oakland, California, sunny Oakland. And unlike the actual episode itself, I moved the camera to somewhere with a nicer backdrop. I'm staying at a friend's house at the moment, and you can see there's some lovely trees and foliage behind me. In this episode, I spoke with James Cusack, who is the chief executive of the organisation Autistica, which does research into issues pertaining to autistic people and works in terms of helping to support, create policy and use that research to affect change in a positive way. Some things I wanted to know, and I won't talk too much in this intro, but I was feeling quite unwell when it was recorded. Had a bit of kind of brain fog, as it's called, and just felt pretty under the weather. If you are watching, you'll probably be able to see that in my demeanor and look a bit zombie-ish. I took a test the next day and realized I had COVID. So recording this from kind of self-isolation. But I still believe the interview kind of has a lot of value in it. And although we had also some technical issues where there was a significant delay in the call and some pixelation, which also made it challenging, I think it worked out. And there's a lot of substance in there, I think, that speaks to some really important issues. Just on the top of my head, we spoke about Autistica's employment plan, which is a document they've prepared, which has objectives for, I think, 2030 in terms of doubling the autistic employment rate. And it speaks to the challenges in terms of obtaining and maintaining work for autistic and, in a wider sense, neurodivergent people, I feel, and also what they are proposing to do that is realistic to try to address this. And so that was really interesting. One of the main ideas is the Neurodiversity Employment Index, which James speaks about and how it works. So that was really important, and I hope you'll find that interesting. Other things we spoke about were how people who potentially don't have an awareness of being autistic could benefit from some of these changes that are being proposed. And we spoke also about the challenges in terms of obtaining and maintaining work that come from one's life prior to the point where they seek employment. So how one's experiences and challenges up to that point make it potentially more difficult to succeed in the same way, or to kind of find gratifying work when for example, one is particularly anxious or has had bad experiences in terms of trying to be a part of a group. And I think that's one of the things about lots of work. There's a lot of talk about work culture, but that work culture is sometimes inaccessible to some, or doesn't align with what feels good for them. We spoke about how treating everyone the same doesn't necessarily need to mean doing the same thing with everyone. As I say, there was some parts where my mind just couldn't think clearly to get out a question. And I find, I think partly related to dyslexia, but a challenge already to sometimes find the language and the words recall it that I'm looking to say, that when you have the idea but you can't necessarily express it. And I felt that even more acutely when suffering from COVID. But as I say, with some editing, it's still a very fruitful conversation, I think, and one I was grateful for James to give the time to have with me. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with James, and I'll speak with you again at the end of it.
I'm James Cusack. I'm the Chief Executive of Autistica. Autistica is the UK's leading autism research and campaigning charity. My background is in autism research. So I had a career in autism research up at the University of Aberdeen before being approached to join Autistica when I was about 30. I'm really passionate about thinking about how we can improve things for autistic people, and in particular in terms of thinking about how research and how innovation and how thinking differently about things can really lead to change for autistic people as well, which is why I was so excited about joining Autistica. Before I started working in autism research, I worked directly with autistic people, and even when I was working in research, I worked in policy, so worked to try and particularly on the Scottish Autism Strategy Bill with a group of people as well. So that really gave me a view of how research alone won't get the job done. You need to really join up research with policy and communications and innovation and action to ensure that you translate the whole thing through, so it ultimately impacts people. And ultimately, I became passionate about autism because from a young age, it was quite obvious that I was autistic. I was diagnosed as being autistic as a child, which meant that I grew up with a number of other autistic people. And it's given me quite a good understanding of the sort of variety of lived experiences that autistic people have, and the real need to develop really significant changes to try and improve things for autistic people. So that's why I'm really excited about what we do at Autistica, which is really all about, like I say, taking research and putting it into action to really, really focus on priorities that are important to autistic people.
Would you define the work that Autistica do primarily as a research group, or is it a combination of kind of research and then finding ways to put that into action?
Yeah, I would say, our primary activity, and historically, and the thing that has made us unique ultimately has been our research. Certainly in the UK, there are other organisations that are focusing on slightly different, that are focusing on other things that are distinct from that. But I think what makes Autistica stand out is, to a large extent, the research. I think globally what makes us unique, though, is the fact that we take that research and we really, really think about how it can make a difference to people's lives. So I think it's, there's definitely something unique about the way that we take research, work with policymakers and autistic people and families to think about how we can ensure that not only the research that we fund and do, but all research that's happening globally ultimately impacts autistic people and their lives.
How do you determine what you decide to do the research on?
So a key thing for us has been working with autistic people and their families to try and understand more about that. Research, there has been quite a significant amount of research which has been done looking into autism. And some of that's been very basic science and biology based, which does have its place. But I think what we really heard when we engaged with autistic people and families is their priority is really on research that can make more of an immediate difference. And there was really 6 things that came through to us that we consistently heard through a series of different engagement exercises. And they were making sure autistic people get the right support from day one. We too often hear of autistic people getting a diagnosis after waiting for years to actually get one and then not having the right support. Then it was around support and treatment and prevention of issues, that mental health issues, and in particular anxiety. So we hear this come through as a huge priority for autistic people and their families. then there was definitely, we definitely heard something on making public spaces better and improving attitudes towards autistic people, and the fact that the environment and the attitudes of people are really often what makes the world a less accessible place, and a place where it's more difficult to do what autistic people want to do in their lives. Then we definitely heard something on employment. The statistics around employment are really unacceptable for autistic people, given the number of people that we see that want to work. And then finally, we knew that health inequalities is a huge issue in autism, which is why we are supporting work on health checks for autistic people to try and help to address that. And on that basis, on those 6 themes that I've mentioned, we've got 2030 goals, which are all about really thinking about how we can change things for autistic people in the future. And that's really what now focuses all of our activity. I think that's a really important step forward for us. It's quite a bold thing to do, because what we're trying to do is really say this is how we want the world to change over the current decade. But we think it's important to be ambitious about the change that we want to see for autistic people, because right now, the experience and the outcomes that autistic people face are too often unacceptable, and as a result of societal failures.
Yeah, thank you for laying those 6 areas out so clearly. I've read the employment plan document, which is very thorough and really powerful. I'm curious what the research that you did for the employment plan document found as the primary challenges or barriers to obtaining work for autistic people.
So I tend to think about this in sort of 2 quite simple buckets. The first is just autistic people's life experience, and whether we're doing everything we can to empower autistic people from day one. And the second thing is, how are you empowering employers to really embrace the challenge and the opportunity that would come with employing a more neurodiverse workforce? So if we take the first one, which is about empowering autistic people, the second one is important as well, and I will get to that. But if you think about the life experiences that autistic people have from quite a young age, they're quite often denied the right support, the right environment. By mid-childhood, a number of autistic people are experiencing some sort of form of anxiety. There's sort of all sorts of negative attitudes, issues around bullying, social exclusion, not being able to access things like work experience, participate in social clubs. If you were to expose anyone to that sort of experience, it would affect how ready they were for the world of work. So I think there's, a significant amount that we need to do to recognise the fact that there are barriers that exist almost before working age. So we need to sort of look at how we can develop programs that support autistic people to be more ready for work, because there are things that you can pick up along the way that are really important. I coach my daughter's football team at the moment, and in that they will learn to work as a team, to communicate, to sort of disagree on things, to build confidence in yourself, to learn about failure and all these different things. These are really important life lessons, and these are things that some autistic people don't get the opportunity to experience. We need to think about what are the things we can do to help people to be more ready for work, because these things help. These things, they don't feel like they're big deals, but they actually do help. They're sort of little things that leverage your opportunities. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do there. And then, as people approach adulthood, and I think we can do some more to empower autistic people, to help them to understand themselves, to help them to understand that it's okay to ask for support, and to know what support to ask for and how to ask for that support, and to recognise the fact that they do have strengths, but also they might have certain support needs as well. And those support needs could potentially vary quite a lot from different person to different person. And so if we can do that, then I think we can have a really positive discussion with autistic people about what's feasible or what sort of support they need as well. Because one thing I do think with this discussion is it quite often degenerates into quite a simplistic binary between, autistic people with high support needs who can't potentially work, or the high achieving autistic person who is doing amazing things in society. The reality is there's like a huge number of people who sit in the middle, and we need to get better at understanding and reflecting that spectrum of people, and trying to think about what sorts of forms of support would work for them. Some autistic people might just need a few reasonable adjustments or no reasonable adjustments. Some autistic people might need continuing ongoing job coaching and support in the workplace. Some autistic people might need a special sort of work placement in order to be able to succeed in the workplace. What we need to do is understand that we need a range of solutions and supports for autistic people. And doing that starts with understanding the autistic person and what they need. And then with the workplace, I think we're quite early days in terms of society's understanding of neurodiversity and autism. And so we need to help to almost sort of take people on the journey with us. I quite often, one thing I really reflect on a lot, and one thing I say a lot, to be honest with you, is that if you look at mental health 20 years ago, they would have sort of seen mental health as being about like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and maybe like major depression. Now we see mental health as about everyone. I think we need to do that with neurodiversity and see autism as part of that. I think then we can have a much more inclusive conversation about this in the workplace, because the reality is that there are some people who are autistic, but there are people across the whole workforce. Every single employee will have things that will enable them to succeed and thrive, and things that will act as a barrier towards that. And I think if we can get better at reflecting that diversity that exists within our workforce, then it doesn't really just benefit autistic people, it benefits everyone and it benefits the organisation. So we all need to get better at reflecting that and understanding that. So I think opening up that conversation through neurodiversity lens, I think, is extremely powerful. And then for doing that, beginning to test different solutions that can effectively work for different organisations and different organisation types as well, I think is really important. And what's really powering all of that at Autistica is a tool we're developing called the Neurodiversity Employers Index. And what we're trying to do through that is to really find a validated way of understanding whether different employers are making changes to their recruitment processes, the retention, the workplace culture, how they make things like reasonable adjustments, which really benefit autistic people, but also just benefit the workplace and the employer in terms of their approach to neurodiversity. And so a key thing we're doing is that sort of sits as the thing that we push out to employers, but underneath that, what we're doing is testing different workplace solutions through our research programs to try and understand, okay, what are the reasonable adjustments that autistic people and other neurodivergent people are commonly asking for? And what we discover for the research that we're doing is they're not particularly expensive, actually. They're not anything to be scared of. And a big barrier for employees is almost taking away that fear factor. And then, then also testing like, okay, so if we want to improve our recruitment processes, how do we do that? What works? What's an effective way of doing this that benefits the whole organisation? And so we've been testing different ways of asking interview questions and so on. How do you send out interview questions ahead of time? When is an interview a valuable approach to take and when is it not? So these are the things we're trying to do, and what we're trying to hopefully do through empowering employers is ultimately make it easier for employers to grasp this issue, to make it digestible, because I think that employers should be able to see this as an opportunity for them, but what they might not be able to see is where the solution is. And so that's where I think we can hopefully be helpful as well. I don't also believe that we're at the stage where I think we need to be more carrot and stick at this stage. This is not the gender pay gap. This has not been going on for a century. We need to give people an opportunity to try and resolve this first of all. And then, if those people won't come on the journey, then we need to think about different types of approaches, maybe perhaps a little bit further down the line. But for now, we're really motivated by the opportunity to try and hopefully show employers there are solutions to this, and they're not big and scary.
Oh, there's so much in that answer that I would want to like go off in different strands on. I kind of want, or maybe we'll have time to touch on all of them if I can kind of hold them in my limited working memory. But just going back to what you said very much at the beginning about recognizing that that autistic people's life experience, for one, impacts how one can potentially access and obtain and maintain employment. So I guess my question is, how do you as an individual, potentially Autistica as an organisation, think that those challenges of the stages prior to entering the workplace or work world can be mitigated?
I think the first thing is it really starts with understanding yourself. And if anyone is put in a position where they are confused about who they are, why they are the way they are, that's pretty hard. And there are lots of people in the world who struggle with that. But if you're autistic and you don't know that you're autistic, or you have to wait a long time to understand that, that's a real challenge. So the first thing is making sure people get diagnosed in a timely fashion, because that doesn't only help the autistic person, it helps the people around them as well to understand who this person is and why they might be different and how they can be supportive as well. So how as a family unit. So job number one is making sure people get a timely diagnosis. Job number two is making sure people get the right support. So not only seeing this through the lens of autism, but seeing it through the ultimately who they are as a person, what support they need, what strengths they have, how you can leverage those strengths, and how you can recognise the needs and difficulties that each person might have. So that's the first thing, making sure you start on the right foot. The second thing is then using that and then implementing it through someone's education and through schooling if they've been diagnosed as a child. Making sure that they are in an accepting environment. So doing things like making sure the whole school understands about autism. I really am a passionate believer in educating children about neurodiversity as well. I don't think that just benefits autistic people, that benefits all kids. All kids wonder why they're not the same as everyone else. And I think it benefits everyone to understand a little bit more about that. We funded some work on that through the University of Edinburgh, which I think is very, very powerful and impressive. And I would say if you can help staff and peers to understand more and change attitudes in that way, that's a very, very powerful driver for change, because then the autistic person is operating in a more accepting environment. We need to sort of look at how we can offer autistic people opportunities to participate in activities that they might not have the opportunity to participate in. And then I think there's a huge amount to do on mental health as well, which is to like I said earlier, to recognise you've got to prevent a lot of the mental health issues that autistic people experience before they happen, if possible. And we're not very good at that as a society yet. I think we're very good. At least to some extent, accept that autistic people do have mental health issues now, but there's still a bit of a let's just wait until they happen approach before we do anything about them. And I would like there to be much more preventative approaches. If you worked in any other area of the health system and you knew that if someone had X, it would mean they were very likely to go on to develop Y, you kind of wouldn't wait until Y happened. If you knew that X, you'd try and stop Y from happening. And I don't think we've got there yet with mental health and autism in terms of that approach, but I think it's a really key step for us to take. That then means that you're optimizing the likelihood of an autistic person being able to have the experiences that they will need to develop and understand the things that will help them to get into work as well. Then I think specific coaching and support for autistic people around work and what's expected of them, work experience. And I know it's very, very valuable. Things like job coaches can be very, very valuable for autistic people. Helping them to understand themselves as they enter the workplace, thinking about the fact that we know a huge number of autistic people go off to university and get degrees, but still that doesn't massively change their likelihood of entering employment in the way that one would probably hope it would. So we know that about 32% of autistic people with a degree currently access employment. It's very low. And so that suggests that it's not just a case of educating autistic people. We need to be supporting people in other ways. So I think these are the things we could do. But I'll always emphasize with these things, it's not about blaming autistic people for these things. It's about giving them the opportunities and support that everyone else is getting to be ready to participate in the workplace. And the reality is that as a society, we have a lot of work to do to get to that position. And I'm very conscious, speaking as an autistic person, that I'm in a very privileged position as being someone that's into work, but that's because I've had a lot of luck and a lot of opportunities that I know that most other autistic people haven't had. And we need to be aware of that the autistic people that have got into a position where they can work, not to undermine it, there's been a lot of hard work along the way, but there's also been for many people like myself a number of opportunities given to them that most autistic people haven't been given.
You mentioned the opportunities you've had to and to be in the position you are now. What do you think happened in kind of your trajectory that worked in a sense to get you to a place where you're doing what I imagine is pretty gratifying work, from like what you spoke about at the beginning about your passion for it? Is that chance, or was there specific things that happened that you engaged with that were super useful and that you would like to see more people have access to?
So there were definitely a few bumps along the road, but overall, so I had a very, very difficult time when I was initially diagnosed. And I went to a specialist nursery from the age of 3, but then didn't get diagnosed until the age of 12. Then I had a very challenging year after that. But then I went to a specific, I know, like the UK's, I think, first autism specific base based within a mainstream school. And that was very powerful for me, because it was exactly what I needed, which was some time in mainstream class and some time getting specific support. And I think getting that right sort of educational environment is really, really important for people. And I never really particularly found one way in which I was very fortunate was I never found the academic side of work particularly challenging. I just found everything else pretty hard. That was that was what I needed support with and to work on. And I guess that was one way in which I was quite lucky, to be honest with you. That's lucky to be in that position where the academic side of things is more accessible to you. But I did have significant challenges in terms of my ability to understand what was going on socially, managing my own anxiety, coping in different types of environments, dealing with things like change and so on. And so getting that support was very, very powerful for me. I was very lucky to have a good group of friends and people. I had interests like football, which I mentioned earlier, which did slightly help. And then when I went off to university, again, I had the right support in place. And I was able to get work experience, which was quite lucky. And a number of things just sort of happened to fall in place in terms of opportunities that arose and so on. And, met my wife second day of university. All these things were quite low probability. And then, it's all, the opportunity Autistica I got approached about. So that was very, very helpful. And and I got amazing support when I joined initially as director of research before then becoming chief executive as well. So all of these things really have got me to where I am today. Having the right sort of parents as well. So my parents, you know, I was in real crisis after I got diagnosed, and I was in a mental health unit and so on. And they really worked hard to stop me from being placed in a residential school in Newcastle 3 hours away, and ensured that I went to the specialist base, even though it was in the neighbouring local authority to mine. You know, if I didn't have parents who were fighting hard for me, but also had the tools to make the case, then I wouldn't be in this position. You know, if that was a sliding doors moment. And I think it's about having the ability to advocate, you know, and that is like a bit of privilege in a way, isn't it? Like, you know, you get that through education, through, you know, having a certain type of personality, through being able to articulate your case. And not everyone necessarily, regardless of how passionate they are about the child, necessarily might be able to do that. And that it was very, very slim margins that got me into that base. And you know, that is I often think about that. You know, if I went to that residential school, would I get the qualifications that I did? Probably not. And what would be the level of ambition for me? Not very high, potentially. So, you know, we all have moments like this in our life, but I think if you're autistic, they're particularly high stakes. And, you know, I'd never ever look at the employment rate in autism and think, oh, I'm employed because I've worked so hard and I'm pretty aware that there's been a number of moments which have been out of my control, which have really helped me to get to where I am. And okay, yes, I've worked hard along the way, and I've done the right things where I can, or you know, but realistically, it's about the opportunities you get. You know,
one of the things that strikes me from your path is thinking, well, I hear you that it was difficult when you were diagnosed and that was really challenging, but potentially fundamentally it was useful to have that awareness because it helped you to identify your strengths and what you needed support with, and kind of have a better understanding of oneself that I feel like has been lacking in my life for a lot of the time, that kind of leads to all sorts of challenges of mental health, of shame. And I wonder going back to employment in a wider sense, like what work, if any, do Autistica do in terms of people that considered potentially autistic but don't have a kind of awareness of autism, or a kind of self-awareness of their own kind of challenges and strengths, who are struggling in work to obtain or maintain it?
I think there's a few things. So the first thing is like helping to understand yourself and seeing this in a positive light. Huge number of autistic people that I speak to, yes, see themselves in a very, very negative light and really battle with that on a daily basis. I would say that, you know, the way the autism diagnosis was experienced to me wasn't particularly positive, if I'm honest. And it's been a sort of continuing daily battle to get to a stage where you sort of learn to appreciate the fact that nobody is perfect and you're not perfect, but you also come with strengths, but you also have certain difficulties and needs as well. And sort of I think there's a huge amount of work to do in terms of how the diagnosis is delivered to really present it in a much slightly more balanced and empowering way. I think there's still too many examples of it just being presented as a series of difficulties in a slightly generic and unhelpful way. We need the diagnosis to really begin to tell people and families about the person. And then in terms of people who are experiencing that sort of journey in the workplace or in adulthood, it's obviously a huge issue. You know, obviously some people meet the diagnosis criteria for being autistic and some people don't. But I think a huge thing we have to do is to think about the work that we're doing Autistic kind of in a pan-neurodiversity neurodevelopmental way. And the reason that is so important is because a huge number of people who are autistic in the workplace, might not even know they're autistic. And like you say, won't even have that awareness, might not even be asking themselves that question. Or B, might know the fact that they're autistic and have been diagnosed with it and have no desire to tell their employer because they're scared. And that's another sort of opportunity that I have. I'm the chief executive of an autism research charity. If I can't tell everyone I'm autistic, who can? So that I often feel like a responsibility to talk openly about it. But we have to acknowledge that because of attitudes and where they are, that some people don't feel safe doing that as well. And in terms of that first group, I think opening up a conversation where we're looking at changing attitudes to neurodiversity is, I think, the key thing that we're really focused on. Helping people to understand and having space to reflect on who they are and what it might mean for them is what everyone in their workforce needs to be doing. At Autistica, we ask everyone to do it. We ask everyone to think about what their working style is, who they are, how they can adapt and think about themselves, whether they're autistic or not. And I think giving people space to understand themselves is really, really important for the person and for your employees in the workforce. It's also really important for your team, and it's really important for your organisation. So I think there's a huge amount we can do to support organisations to understand that, which can then empower the person. I then think there's tools that we can use to help people to understand who they are. And then I think also changing perceptions around autism, what it is, giving people accessible. They might sort of see autism and think, oh, I don't think that's me, or I don't see myself represented in the various depictions that there are out there. And when we have this conversation, you quite often hear people from different parts of the autism spectrum or reflecting different parts of the autism spectrum saying, I don't feel that my story is told enough. And I think the reality is, I don't really know if it's always the case that we're biasing in terms of different stories. I think there perhaps has been a bias in some ways, and we don't often tell enough women's stories, for example. But we just need to tell more stories, more people's stories, and reflect the sort of cultural diversity, racial diversity, and gender diversity as well, and make sure that everyone's story is told and people feel heard and listened to, and to ensure there's sort of relatable experiences as well. Because the reality is you can't, we've got to tell a range of different stories to really ensure that people who might not know they're autistic, they might sort of feel a bit more like, okay, that relates to me. I understand. That's the person I am.
I wonder, just digging into the employment plan, whether you can speak to kind of what you would be suggesting, or what the plan would be suggesting for a scenario like this. So last year I was working a job. I was developing content and was asked to produce something as a small group. And for me, it wasn't clear exactly who this was for and why we were doing it. And for me, I could make this organization anything really, but I really needed to know those details to be able to tailor what I was making to make it to the best I could. And I kept trying to ask, and I clearly stated that I need to know this to be able to make it to the best degree. And it felt for me like a fair question to ask, if being instructed to do something. And the response I was getting was that I was being difficult, and that just to kind of go with it. And I find this really challenging because, first of all, I don't feel in that scenario you're being difficult. And two, it's hard for me to go with it when I still don't have that clarity of why and what. And I don't know whether disclosing a diagnosis would be useful in that sense, because, as you say, people have different perceptions of what different kind of, in inverted commas, conditions are. And in that sense, I wonder, whether you would agree that a kind of progressive future would be one where someone can state a need. It doesn't necessarily need to be linked to any kind of diagnosis or condition. And if it's a reasonable request, that in order for them to kind of do their work to the degree that the organisation would want, that's kind of honoured. Does the employment plan have a kind of sense of how to approach that situations like that?
The point of what you're asking there is like they're sort of just not approach. They're not. It sounds like they're not approaching you where you are and understanding who you are and what you need to be successful, and whether or not you're like autistic or neurodivergent in some way is sort of somewhat, I would, it's not irrelevant, but like it's not, asking whether or not that person is autistic is potentially not even asking the right question. The right question is, what does that person need to be successful? You should be asking that question of every single employee in your organization. And I think what is outdated, in my opinion, is this is just how we do things. Everyone has an organizational culture. We have an organizational culture. We have a set of values. There are certain things about the way that we do things that mean that we suit a certain type of person. Everyone has that. That's fine, but you have to be clear about that, in terms of what you are and how you say you are what you are. But you also need to be asking people, how is it that I, in that context, how is it that I can get the best out of you, and how can I support you? What is it that we can reasonably do as an organization? Because it comes back to reasonable adjustments. And if people aren't doing that, it's not really just like, it's not just like failing people, it's failing themselves as an organization, because they're basically taking an outdated approach. I think the work that Autistica has to do is to help people understand how they have that conversation and help them to understand what, there's sort of like, what are the barriers to them understanding that? Well, part of it's about awareness. So just base awareness of neurodiversity. Part of it is about then intent to act. And then part of it is about what is the actions that they're taking. So there's a bit of awareness and understanding question we need to sort of address, get them to understand this issue more. Then we need to give them, then that should hopefully lead to some intention to action. And then to really get them to make action, we need to make it easy for people, help them to understand, here are the tools that we can have. So one of the things that we're looking at is strength and needs assessments for employees, and how can we use those as a tool for employers. So that, in the first instance, that may be looking at autistic people, but it's a great thing to think about in the context of all employees as well. And then if we can give people those tools, and also give autistic people those tools to use as well, that they can then take to their employers, then I think that's a really powerful thing to be able to do as well. But I think, like you say, the whole thing is about being able to destigmatize this, and also to be able to open this up. So it's about everyone, and it's about, just as employers, getting their head around the fact that all organizations have limits. We understand that, but it's no excuse for not thinking about how you can adapt to the needs of individual people and how we can support people. I just think as a society, we're still slightly stuck in this mindset of everyone's the same, and if I treat this person this way, I should treat this person this way as well. We have to be, it's kind of not the logic of a 3-year-old, really. Like, it's just sort of like, no, everyone's different. Everyone has different needs. It's not a complex one to understand, but as a society, we seem to really struggle with it.
Well, one's values could include adjusting oneself to meeting the needs of different people. So it can be consistent in a sense of kind of, I want to treat people the same. And the way that you treat people the same potentially is by recognizing how you potentially adjust, and they adjust in each kind of interaction. There doesn't need to be an inconsistency there in a way.
Yeah, that is consistent, like you say. And that is consistent. We have people who are parents or caregivers or carers of elderly people, and how we approach them is different to how we might approach somebody who's in their 20s. Like, they all have different needs and requirements in terms of flexibility. it's fine. Like, you do what you can and listen to people and try and empathize with where they are and do your best to be supportive. You know, it's not just a neurodiversity point. It's about your whole workforce. It's just about empathy and understanding and listening to people.
So I'm interested in terms of how some of the findings that have come out of the employment plan will be kind of enacted and realised. And I imagine that the neurodiversity index is one of those ways. Can you maybe speak to how you see that working out, and potentially like how you might mitigate it becoming a bit of a kind of not a tick box sounds very reductive. I don't mean it like in that sense, but something that kind of employers are really recognizing the true value and the why of doing something beyond kind of a superficial sense of kind of we are a diverse, progressive workforce, without actually recognizing what they're missing out on and what the kind of core purpose of the index.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. So the key goal of the Neurodiversity Employers Index is to make sure that employers, in terms of their approach to neurodiversity, really changes in line with what we're finding and what the evidence is suggesting. So a key way in which we're trying to ensure the Neurodiversity Employers Index leads to real change in terms of employers' approach to neurodiversity, and in particular to groups of people who are particularly affected by that. So, you know, for example, autistic people, is to recruit a range of organisations to help test and validate the index, to try and measure if it is really helping to make a real difference. So we've been really lucky. We've had some fantastic organisations. We've had almost 60 organisations so far who've signed up on a confidential basis in the first instance to trial the index, and we're still looking for more. We're hoping to get over the 100 mark, and that will really help us in terms of validating this tool. The sort of other thing we're going to do is we're going to continually change and adapt the index to reflect the latest evidence. So continually looking at how we can validate it more effectively, understand it. A key thing, like you say, is getting people's employers buy-in. So we're going to have to work very, very hard on that. But I think a key thing is the research in terms of making sure it isn't just a tick box exercise. And a key thing the research can also do is make sure it's not a tick box exercise, while also making it a sustainable exercise for employers. We have to recognise that people will have, you know, a key part of getting people to change is showing that the commitment associated with doing this is a sustainable commitment, a commitment that's in their interest as an organisation. So that's a key thing that we'll also be testing as well, which is like, how do we create a tool which will help to deliver change, but will also be sustainable for different organisations. And part of that will be thinking about the scale of organisations. So big, large organisations have a huge capacity in some ways to develop change, but might have different barriers. Whereas a small organisation, you know, that employs 10 people, for example, will have limited capacity in some ways, but might be able to make changes more quickly. So it's about thinking about these issues and really testing that and thinking it through in a thorough way. If we can do that, and we can do that well, then it's huge opportunity for us to make a real difference to the environments that we create and employers approaching neurodiversity, and also in particular, which obviously we're very driven by autistic people, but the experiences that autistic people have in the workplace. So we're really excited by this. This is the driver, the Neurodiversity Index, of all the research that we are doing to test different solutions, and the index will help us to make sure that when we engage with employers, those changes are ultimately made.
Are you able to speak briefly to just how, in its current form, the index works, like what an organisation would that's engaging with it would do?
So at the moment, there's an online tool which people can sign up to, and then we use that as the basis at the moment for testing it, and that's being validated at the moment. It's quite early days in terms of its testing. So that's what we're developing at the moment. What we're hoping to do is to some extent automate the process. And that will hopefully, from our side, keep the resource level management sustainable in terms of its delivery. So we're sort of testing that at the moment and seeing where we need to do it. I think that the other key thing about the index is you go through this process, and it's not like it's a supportive process. So we're not like, you don't get to the end of it and then sort of sit on the naughty step like if you've not been doing all of the right things. Actually, what we say is like, you are like struggling here and here are the evidence-based solutions, and here are the changes you can make. We'll talk to you in a year and see how you're getting on. So it's meant to be a supportive process. So the whole idea is like, we get this is difficult for some people, we get that, you know, we all struggle with these agendas sometimes. This is not too difficult to make changes in. So the whole idea is that, you know, we're supporting people. And also the other great thing about this index is it helps us to understand from an employer's perspective, where are they having particular difficulties as well. So it's also a feedback mechanism for us, because once we can understand that, then we can begin to implement changes.
So with the index, does the autistic person identify themselves to HR as being autistic, and then they are part of the index for that organisation and receive support or check-ins? I'm curious in practical sense, like what is the work that both parties need to do, and how does Autistica kind of involved in that?
So part of it's about asking employers to assess where they are. A part of it's about asking employees about their experiences, both neurodivergent or not. And then we use all of that to then assess what the workplace is like and how we can make changes. So it's about getting multiple sources of information, and then on that basis we can help to make an assessment of what needs to happen next.
How does Autistica think about autistic people, empowering autistic people to set up their own organisations and initiatives? Like, is that some work that you do?
So a big part of what we do is looking at is this experience of self-employed people. So actually that's one of the things that we learned a lot about in developing this plan through engaging with autistic people, is to make sure the voice of self-employed people is included as well. And, you know, things like an index might not help with that. So it's thinking about other pieces of research that we can do. And we don't have perfect solutions for that just yet, if I'm honest with you. But I think it's a really important consideration. And I think we need to think about that as well, because I know that for a number of autistic people, being self-employed is a really important thing, because it gives them it almost enables them to have the adjustments and the freedoms that they're looking for as well. So trying to think about why autistic people go self-employed and what the benefits are and how we can support autistic people in that, I think is really, really something we need to think very carefully about.
Lastly, just before we wrap, I know Autistica is involved with the Buckland review. I spoke to Sir Robert Buckland, who's leading that. What are your hopes for that review, and what is Austica's role in the review?
So Autistica has a big part of what Autistica does is to try and work with policymakers and politicians to try and really embed change for autistic people. Probably for the last almost 2 years, I've been working with Sir Robert and looking at some of the issues that autistic people face and what the political opportunities are in that context. And we really identified employment as a significant opportunity. And that's why we put together the Buckland Review. So we've worked with Sir Robert in terms of developing the terms of reference for that and getting the Prime Minister to agree to the review. And now the review has been announced and is under place. We're part of the sort of core working group alongside himself and DWP in terms of collating and working and hosting roundtables to understand what the different experiences of people are and what the practical things we can do. Really, for me, the Buckland Review is not going to change things in a day. It's about creating the structures that lead to a cycle of progress for me. So what I want the Buckland Review to do is to help to do that, to think about the systemic change that we need to deliver for autistic people, to really ultimately change their employment outcomes and to create the structures that will enable us to understand are we making a difference? Are we progressing? Are we seeing that employment rate change for autistic people? And so that's really about making sure we're changing attitudes, making sure we're making workplaces more accessible for autistic people, making sure autistic people's routes into work are more accessible. There are things that aren't included in the review, which we've talked about, which are really important. So like getting access to the right support in that early life experience, that isn't included in the terms of reference. So I'm quite aware that as well, this review won't solve that, but we need to come up with political solutions for that as well. It's because it's quite serious, the waiting lists that autistic people are facing in terms of diagnosis. But this is an important step forward and an important catalyst for progress. And I really hope that over the next decade, we'll look back on this Buckland review and say that was a key enabler that got us to a position where we were able to double the employment rate for autistic people. Okay, we're not done. Still a huge amount of work to do, but that this really helped us to take a step in that direction. So that's what I want the Buckland review to do, is to really create a bit more structure around and create a framework that will basically allow us to make this goal achievable.
Thank you very much, James. I really appreciate your time. I could ask endless questions, I think, and go in so many different directions.
It's no problem at all, and it's been great to talk to you as well. And yeah, sorry I have to go. My daughter's going to come bundling in at some stage, so I thought I'd spare you of that. But it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Thank you again to James Cusack for taking the time to speak with me. It was a genuine pleasure to do that, even feeling pretty rotten and with all the kind of technical challenges we had. I appreciated James's patience, and again the kind of the depth of thought and passion that James offered in terms of the answers to my questions, and the willingness, I think, to address them all. Just a few notes, housekeeping notes on Working to Work. I appreciate the people that have watched and have listened to the podcast and to the videos on YouTube. I want to thank the couple of people that have left some comments, particularly in terms of the sound levels. That kind of feedback is really helpful, and I'm really open to it. So yeah, please do share, and I'll try and address those issues to make the work as accessible as possible, because I want to give these topics exposure, and I don't want there to be any barriers to people kind of being able to engage with them. So yeah, that feedback is very welcome, and your support, even in terms of subscribing and sharing and liking, is also greatly appreciated, so that more people can see it and be and kind of both gain an awareness of what maybe they don't necessarily have experience of, but also those that do potentially have experience of it can feel some sense of comfort, or whatever the opposite of not being alone is, a sense of camaraderie, of shared experience, of resonance with these challenges, and potentially the confidence to be comfortable in expressing what's challenging, where one needs support, and what they feel should be changed. So thank you all, and I look forward to speaking with you in the next episode.